Morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time for this extremely short notice, quick webinar on developments in the US. This might be a little less polished than our webinars usually are, simply because in the interest of time, we thought it was more valuable to give you a quick update rather than a perfectly polished update a little bit too late. And so some of this will be familiar, but for those of you who didn't attend our last webinar, I'm going to quickly give an update on the status of where everything is, and then we're going to move into a discussion with my esteemed fellow panelists. So as a point of departure, and so to give you some perspective on how big the US is in our lives and how big we are in theirs, South Africa, about 8% of our exports go to the USA, and that 8% is about 0.44% of their imports. So the US is important in our lives. We, just looking at size, are considerably less important in theirs. And a similar picture emerges if we look at their exports to South Africa. So the US sends approximately 0.29% of their exports to South Africa, and that is about 9% of our imports. And of course, a big function of this is simply how large the US is compared to South Africa. So nothing too alarming in here, apart from the alarm President Trump has expressed at us running a trade surplus with the US. What is the status on the Liberation Day tariffs? So as things stand right now, to the best of our understanding, this is how things look. So on the 1st of August, the 30% reciprocal tariffs will be imposed. Then we have the Section 232 duties. So these are also known as national security duties. And for these, in place already, we have a 50% tariff on steel and aluminium. And this will be including copper as of the 1st of August. Then we have 25% tariff already in place on cars. And the excluded products at the moment are critical minerals. So things like platinum, gold, and a few others. So not all critical, some precious metals in there, etc. And this more or less is how things look. Important to note, the Section 232 duties do not compound on top of the reciprocal duties. So it will be one or the other, not both together, nor will they move to the higher of the two, which is a question I've been asked before. However, this doesn't stop here. So below on the table, you will see there are still 6 232 investigations, either not yet implemented, so copper has been finalized but not implemented, and the other have not yet been implemented. So there was a 21-day period to comment on this. And of course, this doesn't mean that more of these investigations will not kick off. Yeah, Duane, I'm going to quickly hand over to you for this portion of the conversation. Do you want to quickly walk us through this?
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Morning, everybody. So I think what is important to bear in mind here is that the so-called Liberation Day tariffs that were announced in April have now gone up to the 30%, okay, are under this International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. Now that is, I suppose, fundamentally under judicial review, okay? We do expect that. Some of the latest is that decision could come out of the court system so that the US administration lost their case at the lower court. It's now been under appeal. So those duties, that court case could get heard by the end of July. Okay, and that's why we think the duties, the revised 30% are from 1st of August. And you can see some of the commentary coming out of the US administration, like, is it really the 1st of August? And I think it's going to be linked to when that court case I think gets finalized. So I think it's important to bear in mind that's where all those powers sit, and that's how those 30% duties are getting implemented. So let's assume the Trump administration loses that case. Okay, he has got other instruments that he can use. So you can see already, as Donald has already mentioned, the Section 232 duties, where there's a couple of investigations that have been triggered. So I think it's also important to bear in mind, like on some sectors, like aluminium and iron and steel, we've actually had those duties in place since 2018. So it's not a new phenomenon, contrary to popular belief. It's just obviously now getting extended. So you can see now the latest one that's actually been investigations being done and finalized, and the announcement happened is on the copper. So what we probably could expect, so if the IEPA case is lost, I would probably expect a lot more products to be investigated under Section 232. Then you've got the other acts that we've listed here. So you can see that Section 301. That is, you could assume there's quite a lot of, I suppose, noise in the press around Brazil, where they're going to be implementing another additional 50% duty on trade, or what they call is unfair trade from Brazil, and that's under that Section 301. Okay, and then you've got these other acts, 122 and 338, where they've got different time periods and also different rates of duty. So those also could start to be used if the if they lose the case under the IEPA. Thanks, Donald.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Duane. Moving on, just a quick snapshot of what are the things that we export to the US. So you'll see an enormous part of our trade is essentially rocks on ships. So this is minerals of some sort, precious metals, and so on. That makes up a very substantial part of our trade. Then we've got automotive, not just cars, but also components. The effect of all of this is quite restrained to a small number of companies, but the effect on them is very, very big. So, but nevertheless, automotive, steel and aluminium, which is that little bit right at the top of the chart. You can barely see the gray bit. That is steel and aluminium. And then everything else is the balance that will attract the 30%. Where will we pay the most duties? And so this is just a spread of where the money will actually be potentially spent if everything happens according to plan. Now, I mean, of course, this is a very crude representation. This just assumes the volumes stay the same and the duties are simply paid. That's not going to happen in reality. But that's what you get on short notice is a slightly quick and dirty view on this. But nevertheless, it gives us a sense where the sensitivity lies. Of course, cars are a big deal, but this is a very interesting pattern. Thank you to my colleague Annika who put this together. But our exports of cars from the US represented here in sort of 3-month chunks so that we can end conveniently in May, which is the month we have the most recent data for. And you could see we've had a fairly steady decline of exports of cars to the US, at least passenger vehicles, for the last little bit. All right. Skipping over, what is the impact of all of this going to be on South Africa? So just very quickly, these tariffs, if implemented as promised on the products promised, affects about 1.3% of our GDP. That doesn't mean it's going to move the GDP down by 1.3%, but just that is the portion of our GDP that has the potential to shift. And if you want to understand why that is such a small number, it's just that there are lots and lots of things that make up your GDP. Exports are not the only bit. So on this note, I'm going to hand over to Lawrence for the slide. Thank you, Lawrence.
Actually, I'm going to hand over to Duane on this slide.
Okay. Oh, Duane, even better.
Thanks, Donald, Lawrence. Okay, so I think this is just so the EY economics team also did some analysis around, okay, how do we think this is going to be impacting, taking into account what Donald was saying, is that at this point in time, obviously a big part of our exports are PGMs, or critical minerals not subject to the duties. Okay, at this point, okay, we've got differential rates on automotives, 50% on iron and steel, and copper and aluminium. Okay, and then also 30% on I suppose everything else. Okay. So we expect that could potentially impact our exports between 1.4 and 1.6 billion dollars. So that's obviously a big number. Okay, but as we know, South Africa does export to obviously many other countries. So it's obviously a smaller percentage of it's quite a small percentage of our total exports. Okay, but I think it's just important to also bear in mind that it probably does impact quite a small number of companies just because of the sectors that are going to be the most impacted. But again, still quite a big number. Yeah, I think Lawrence has also done some modeling as well. So I think his numbers are, I think, slightly higher than the EY numbers. Maybe Lawrence, you've got some comments on, I suppose, your modeling.
So yeah, so thanks, Duane. Yeah, so we also, um, my colleague and I, Jing Qian from University of Cape Town, the Prism Research Unit, we also conducted some analysis to try and assess the effect of these tariffs on South African exports and also on South African employment. Our numbers come to a slightly higher number, around 2.3 billion, as opposed to the sort of 1.6 or so, I think that Duane gets upper bound that Duane and his team estimate. I think a key fundamental difference with our approach or our results is that what we find is that a key danger to South African exports are not only the tariffs that the US imposes on South African goods, but also the size of the tariffs imposed on South Africa's competitors. And so the extent to which South Africa faces relatively high tariffs, and our analysis suggests that the 30% reciprocal tariff places us on the upper end of the countries affected compared to our competitors. The effect that this has could lead to a diversion of our exports or the diversion of US consumers away from South African goods towards our competitors' goods. And that amplifies the negative effect of the tariffs on South African goods. So our real concern is also, again, here is what our tariffs are relative to competitors. And if the competitors get lower tariffs compared to us, we could find that the export losses are accentuated. I think that's the only substantive addition to, I think, the results that Duane and his team have calculated.
Duane?
Yeah, so I agree with Lawrence, and I think also as well, there's lots of other, I suppose, other indirect impacts that we can also start seeing. Let's take on sort of iron and steel. Is that effectively what the US has done on all those 232 duties? Is what they're saying is that if your product that you export into the US, okay, it might be in a tariff heading subject to the 30%, but that product has got iron and steel and aluminium in it. Okay. And also we probably also think copper is that you're going to pay the 50% duty, okay, on the iron and steel content in the product. And if you then can't prove what the iron and steel content is, the duty will go to the higher of the two. Okay. So again, that's going to be how that's all going to be administered is I think really complicated, just building on what Lawrence said. And so I think all we're trying to say on this slide is that obviously there's I suppose lots of bilateral negotiations happening, okay, since April, so since Liberation Day. And I suppose some of the outcome of some of those are starting to, I suppose, trickle out. Okay, so a good example is the UK with access. So I suppose agreement was actually quite interesting, okay, specifically for the automotive sector. So how they handle the automotive sector is they're going to be giving duty-free access, effectively a quota to the first 100,000 cars that go into the US. So those will be duty free, and any cars above that will carry the 25% 232 duty rate. Now, obviously, that hasn't filtered into our negotiations between South Africa and the US. So it's going to be interesting to see if that is also where we land, if we ever do a deal with the US, because there is I suppose, a bit of a recipe that has been agreed with the UK. So I assume most countries are probably trying to do a similar deal if they can, yeah, agree on I suppose probably mainly the non-trade issues that are on the table between the two countries. Thanks, Donald.
Duane, so that
Hmm.
the allocation of that quota, I mean, is there any sense of how that will happen? Is it based on the
First
amount
come,
of
first served.
okay, okay. Now, I thought it
Yeah.
was based on the amount of Trump meme coin you might have purchased.
Yeah, so my understanding is I think it's based on what lands there first. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that kind of detail will come out on the implementation. All that detail hasn't been sorted, but the last I heard from our global team, it was virtually when the stuff lands, which does seem to be a bit of a bun fight, I think. So I assume there'll probably be a permit kind of process that you would have under most restrictive when you've got import restrictions and some kind of quota.
And are there any other products which are looking at a similar quota concept, or not to the best of your knowledge?
No, not as far as I know. I think the car one is, I think, at the top of the list, because obviously I think it also impacts the UK. They also export quite a bit to the US. So yeah, so hopefully we can land on something similar. So that effectively will mean probably looking at historical trade flows. And I think obviously Donald, the slide you put up earlier with, I suppose,
Yes.
the declining trade flows, does that then, I suppose, put us at a disadvantage depending when you use the history to set the quota?
Yeah, that's a fair point. All right. And then Lawrence, I believe this is you.
Thanks. Um, so these are just some slides and some policy recommendations that emerged out of our earlier report. And clearly this is difficult terrain because the environment is changing so quickly. I mean, today we have tariffs, tomorrow another country has tariffs. And how do we actually respond to these particular challenges that we face? And clearly, this is an open area for discussion. I can't claim anyone knows precisely what we should do because it's complicated, and the uncertainty, I think, around policy and response is enormously high. We essentially try to categorize these sets of policies around key areas. For example, the immediate concern, for example, would be diplomacy, signaling engagement and quick wins. And clearly, the government's been engaging in diplomacy. It unfortunately hasn't been effective in reducing the tariff from 30%. But I think there's still scope. In the letter that was sent to President Ramaphosa, it indicated that there is space and scope for consider further negotiation and discussion. So I think diplomacy issues I think are critical. I think also, though, we can do a little bit better on signaling our intent to deal with some of the concerns and constraints raised by the US regarding barriers to US imports into our country. So, for example, the US, the National Trade Estimate Report identifies many different problems relating to access of food products in the South African market, relating to access to barriers to US investments in the South African market, barriers are related to government purchases in South Africa that are biased against against imports, etc. So there is a list of products that are of key concern. Some of these are very easy to resolve. I would argue, for example, that replacing the specific tariff on poultry, on specific tariff imposed or anti-dumping duty imposed on tariff on poultry with the ad valorem tariff is pretty easy. Our tariff rate quotas aren't filled on those products. That's a relatively easy signal to impose unilaterally to indicate that we really are intent to deal with some of these concerns and constraints. So rather than a quid pro quo style approach, I think we can do some easy wins on a unilateral approach to signal our intent to deal with some of these concerns. The second issue is I think we need to do much better to engage with US companies in South Africa. There are over 600 companies in South Africa. These companies have, in some cases, have argued there's been insufficient engagement. But why the engagement is really important is it turns out that we are a large net those companies, or US is a large net recipient of income flows through the primary income account. In other words, they are net beneficiaries of their investments in South Africa. So we repatriate large investments to the US in surplus, actually. And so these companies benefit from their location within South Africa. And so engaging with these companies further to signal those benefits to the US and to specific areas in the US, I think is a key part of the engagement. And so on. And clearly, I think there's some process of dealing with some vulnerable firms, and this export promotion in terms of finding different markets may kick into place as well. Then in the next slide, Donald.
Let me.
Then I think in the medium term, it's really thinking about institutional frameworks and trade agreements. And so one of this is about securing some of these exemptions through these trade agreements, like the UK did, try and lock in a lower level of tariffs and reduce tariffs on key products like vehicles and so on. So this is about trying to bind ourselves into an arrangement with the US and a trade agreement. And I think this is part of the agenda. That's a medium-term focus that we have to ensure. I think there's a second component of this is dealing with AGOA, which is set to lapse in September. And so AGOA is an important driver of South African exports. It's not the biggest driver. In fact, I would argue it's exaggerated in some cases, but it's a key player. And so we need to try and negotiate a continuation of that access. That's going to, and so then I think there are many different institutional arrangements. The Minister has already spoken around this. This is the trade and investment agreement with the US. We have an agreement. It's a handshake agreement. It's not a rules-based agreement, but nevertheless, it was configured around dealing with negotiations, discussions around trade and investment. But it was dormant. It never really kicked off. And so it's in this process about kicking in and reinvigorating this as a forum for engagement to discuss issues around trade and investment. I would argue, however, that that's not a substitute for a proper rules-based agreement, because so we really need to think a little bit more carefully about locking in through a rules-based agreement, hopefully with the US, but also I think with other countries as well. Then the next slide.
But before we move, Lawrence, I just want to bring Duane in on that comment. Duane, you had an idea about how we should approach such a rules-based agreement.
Yeah, Donald. So, I mean, the US has got a disadvantage on imports into South Africa if you're comparing it with the EU as an example, okay, and the UK. Okay, so we've got a trade agreement, sort of bilateral trade agreement, two-way trade agreement between the UK and Europe. Okay, and that is locked in, as Lawrence said, right? Okay, it's a rules-based agreement with origin rules, all that stuff, and we then know what the differential duty rates are between the most favored nation rates. I mean, a good example we like to use is automotive. Okay, so automotive, the normal rate of duty, MFN rate, which would be applicable to the US, will be 25%, but if it comes from Europe, you're paying, what, I think 17%. So obviously a differential. Okay. So I think so you've got a recipe. So the question is, yeah, should that be our starting point? I'm not saying it has to be the whole exactly the same, but I think that would then probably be signaling, I think as Lauren's saying, is that we want to be having a formal trade agreement, and then you actually, yeah, I suppose copying, if that's the right word, to then at least the US can say, well, at least we've got the same access into the South African market as European and UK companies do. Thanks.
I mean, my concern with that is that Trump has proven to not adhere to his own agreements. And so I guess my fear is that we go down that road, and which is the road that Mexico and Canada went down in his first term. And then in his first week in office, he simply breached the agreement. I see this morning another announcement of high tariffs he's now going to impose on Canada. So the challenge we've got, he's got trade agreements with South Korea, many other countries, and the US appears to be just indifferent to these agreements. So what is the risk that we go down this road, we make the offer, the US accepts the offer, and then just proceeds to continue doing what they do anyways?
But I think the difference, Donald, is a trade agreement would lock it in for long term. Okay, I get this could be variability in the next couple of years. Okay, but again, yeah, trade agreements, they've been there a long time, right? Okay, so you might have short-term fluctuations, but I think you'd have much more longer-term certainty.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point. We started the process of negotiating a trade agreement with the US, if I'm not mistaken, around 2004. And then when Minister Rob Davies took over, those negotiations were effectively stopped. And to the best of my knowledge, they've never been revived again. But I don't think they're sort of terminated. They're just pending someone picking up the phone and saying maybe we should continue this. So interesting. Thank you very much, guys.
So
Lawrence, back.
yeah, maybe just to add on to this point, I think Duane's exactly right. A trade agreement is a long-term agreement, and who knows what happens post the Trump period.
Of
But
course.
what is interesting about exporter responses, what suggested, and Duane at the firm level may have a better understanding, is these agreements allow firms to, if they're long-term, to lock in investment now for the future. So
Yeah.
it creates some certainty in this enormous uncertain environment. And so it's not a guarantee that the US won't renege on some of these, but it's more likely that they won't. Now, even within the US Mexico Canada agreement, that agreement is holding with regard to many products. And so those products still enter duty free. Now, not all, so the steel, etc., are still imposed, but for the many other products, the agreement is still holding. Now, for South Korea, etc., it's not the case. I think so. That's the first point. I think the second point is I think one of the agreements, our trade agreement with the US didn't go forward is because of services. Now, the US is a big service-oriented company. These big five companies, that's its global dominance and its area of comparative advantage. We also are a big services economy as well, at least within the African region. But it was our concern around opening up our services economy to the competition, I think, that halted the agreement. And so I would argue that we need to not only expand in terms of thinking of goods trade and agreements around goods, we need to incorporate the services into the agreement. We are doing so with respect to the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, but we haven't done so with respect to these other products. Now, where this is also useful is the US runs a large trade surplus. I think it's $1.3 billion with respect to South Africa in terms of the services account. We run a deficit in the goods, but they run a large a surplus with respect to their services sector. And so I think incorporating services is one other avenue to really build on their comparative advantage and emphasize the gains from trade that may associate with a longer term agreement. I think the final point I wanted to kind of mention is I think one of the key reasons we've made very little progress on trade agreements and free trade agreements is from 2010, 2007, the trade policy, the National Industrial Policy Framework, and then 2010, the Strategic Trade Policy Framework, really de-emphasized preferential trade agreements as a mechanism to gain market access. And it pushed for shallow partial agreements. Mercosur was a consequence of that agreement, that approach. And Mercosur effectively is a dead agreement for us. It doesn't give us any substantial access to South American markets. Similarly, we don't give their economies access into our markets. This differed from the EU agreement and the SADC agreement, which were deep. And so I think we need to reapproach this and think about expanding our trade agreements to third countries to try and lock in markets into the East, for example. And when we look at the tariff barriers, it's not access into the EU or US or even Japan on goods that is problematic. It's that real tariff barriers are in these emerging economy markets where we haven't locked in market access through trade agreements. And I think this is part of our broader, longer term strategy in terms of diversifying markets and creating market access opportunities. BRICS. Okay. So I think that's part of our getting those longer term. It's about this diversification, domestic reforms, and competitiveness. Now, I think I want to close off on one issues, and I'm not so I'm still thinking about this. The WTO framework as a multilateral institution or an institution to negotiate multilateral deals is struggling. The appellate board isn't filled. It's effectively defunct. The Doha round failed to make any progress. So South Africa's priority has been around multilateral engagement within the WTO. What it's ignored is the plurilateral discussions that are occurring on the side. These are kind of groups of the willing negotiating amongst willing partners. And out of principle, we haven't engaged in that. I like the principle, but we're flogging a dead horse to some extent on the multilateral front. I think there's space to work much more closely around plurilateral agreements within the WTO or even with outside of the WTO. One of which, for example, is on the e-commerce. We're not part of what's called the Joint Statements Initiative. This is a plurilateral discussion around e-commerce rules within the WTO. We haven't participated in this. We're left out on the side of that engagement. And that's a key area driving future growth in trade, particularly for trade and services. And so I think we can try and form coalitions around areas of common interest to help insulate ourselves from unilateral decisions by large partners like the US, for example. And finally, we all know this. It's a critical thing. What is very interesting about South African trade, even with preferential partners, is we don't fill our opportunities. Take AGOA, for example. We have access to around 1,750. We export 1,750 products. Only 800 and something of those, 1,750 AGOA eligible products to the US. We only use AGOA preferences for around 800 and something of those. There are 5,000 possible products we could export under AGOA. Again, we only make use of 833. I think the point here I'm trying to make is we have deep supply constraints that inhibit South African firms from making use of opportunities abroad. And without dealing with these substantive supply constraints, transport, trade costs, etc., infrastructure, it's going to be very hard to realize export opportunities and respond to some unilateral adverse shocks like the US has imposed on the South African economy. That's a very long, broad view of some of these issues.
Well, I might add to that, Lawrence, that the sort of the stance inside government around trade agreements is viewed purely from the side of what we are going to let in. So we can't we can't allow competition into our market from abroad. And our localization strategy that the countries, or certainly government, has wholeheartedly adopted is quite blunt. It just says we shouldn't be importing things we can make here, and that's the end of it. And so trade agreements are viewed largely as a risk rather than an opportunity to grow your exports, and you need to give some concessions to get better access. And I think there's a concern, maybe not even a badly placed concern, that we are not a competitive country at most manufactured goods. And so the idea that we allow more competition in is seen simply as a threat, and that's it. So just an observation. We're almost done, guys, with the last slide coming up. Duane, I think this was yours, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So I think from a practical perspective, I mean, what are we saying, what we're advising companies to do, right? Okay, so I think what is certain with the US, okay, is it looks like duties are here to stay, even at a certain level. Okay, they might go up or down, whether it's 10%, 30%, or whatever. And on certain sectors, I think, and I think that's been illustrated by the Section 232 duties on sort of iron and steel, aluminium. They've been there since 2018. So our view is, are those going to go anywhere in a hurry? The answer is unlikely. Okay, and now we've got copper. So I think what we were saying is, right, okay, guys, start to understand your vendor, okay, your customer, your intercompany agreement. So start looking at your I suppose your operational structure. Okay. Who are your customers? Who are your vendors? And these intercompany agreements, especially for multinational corporations who are trading cross-border, start to really think about those. And I think the reason why that's important is because I think for many years, and it's probably linked to the earlier discussions around trade agreements, like Lawrence said, we don't really use all the benefits that are in them. And I think some of that is linked to how the benefit is in the trade agreement.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So I think duties have generally been quite low. So I think most companies have probably lost the skill to understand what we would call duty planning. Okay, around, do you understand how you can minimize your duty? And remember, duty is generally driven on step one, your tariff classification. Okay, and tariff classification on some products can be, I think, a really complex process. So when everything is duty free, do you care whether it's right or wrong? Probably the answer is no. But when you've got all these differential duty rates, okay, and which are driven by tariff heading. Okay, so the US will have a tariff list on aluminium and iron and steel, what's in and subject to 50% duties. So do you fully understand um, the tariff heading of your product? Okay, so again, just a lot more care in the tariff classification of your product. Secondly, duties are determined by where the product comes from. So we call that origin. So again, when everything is subject to 0% duty or low duties, where the stuff comes from doesn't matter. Now it matters because we've got other countries that will have higher or lower duty rates than us. So we need to start to put systems and processes in place to make sure we fully understand how origin is calculated, and have you got systems and processes in place to actually calculate it. Okay? Because I think we do have to acknowledge a lot of the stuff we might be exporting. So we might export cables as an example, but it's got lots of imported content in it. Okay, so do you fully understand? Does it meet the origin requirements or not? And then the final one is value. So duties. So virtually all the duties we've spoken about so far, it's an ad valorem duty rate. Okay, so it's a percentage based on what we call customs value, and customs value is specifically defined globally. We actually use a common definition. And there's certain items which are included in that value, and certain items which are not included in that value. So a good example would be things like, say, distribution rights, in some cases, royalties. Other cases, if you've got a whole series of transactions, you're exporting through a trading house that sits in Switzerland into the US. The US allows a concept called what we call first sale. So effectively, it's a sale from South Africa to the Swiss trading company and not the sale into the US. So again, start looking really carefully at how all your transactions and the values of those transactions are structured. So for any multinational corporations, we'd say to them, start really looking at what we call their transfer pricing policy, which is generally there to manage income tax, but it does also impact the value of goods that now go into export destinations. Okay, so those, I think, the basics that I think need to be re-looked at, which I think of for many companies they have not looked at them for many years, and start looking at I suppose deferral mechanisms, using of bond stores. Obviously, these duty rates are going up and down. Okay, so the question is, okay, so you export a lot, and some of the analysis we've done with our UR Global colleagues, you can see how there's been spurts of imports into the US. They're putting it into bond stores, and clearing stuff at lower rates of duty, like the 10%, because they do know that the rate will go up, and they don't know what it is going to be. So there has been spurts in imports into the US. So those are, I suppose, as is structuring what you're currently doing, okay, to fundamentally make sure you know what your duty exposure is going to be. Okay? You then put a plan in place to either take advantage of how you currently export to minimize your value and get rulings out of the US customs authorities, okay, to pay duty on lower values. And then start looking at, I suppose, medium and longer term mitigation strategies around your supply chain, changing origin of supply, and also your diversification of your export strategy. Thanks, Donald.
All right. Duane, I'm going to move us directly into the Q&A. I'll try to herd the cats with the Q&A here. Duane, I'm going to direct this question to you.
Yeah.
Do the tariffs come into effect on automotive goods shipped after the effective date? In other words, if we ship goods, sea freight prior to the effective date of 1 August, if it lands in the USA 8 weeks later, are we exempt from paying the additional tariffs when the goods land because it was shipped in July?
So interesting questions. I think there's probably two questions there, especially on automotive. So automotive are still going to be subject to the 25% duty. They're not going to be subject to the 30% duty. Okay. So let's make sure that clear. So that 25% has been in there for a while. So that's on automotive. Okay. I suppose the second point would be you obviously pay duties on clearance into the US. Okay. So it's all about when the goods are cleared. So it's the duty rate on the date of clearance. So that's why some companies are either if they think the duties are going to go up, so to a 30%, they're exporting the stuff and clearing the stuff before. So like now, what we do know at this point is that the 30% is going to be effective on the 1st of August, unless that gets pushed out based on the comments I said earlier. So companies could be in a big rush to say, well, if I get everything over, it'll be paying me the 10%, and then from the 1st of, or if it gets cleared after the 1st of August, it will be subject to the 30%. But just obviously that's the products that are not already subject to the 232 duties, like your iron and steel and aluminium. Those duties are already in place
Yes.
and open for a while.
Agreed. Lawrence, I'm going to throw this to you, and if you are not comfortable, we'll just make Duane answer it again. Are there any views, expectations that the EU/UK may negotiate and agree duty-free quotas for US autos? Duane, I think you partly answered that, but I'm not sure if anyone wants to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty back to my point is that obviously the UK has got an agreement. Whether the EU will follow that, I mean, I don't know, to be really honest. There's obviously lots happening behind closed doors and what is important to the EU. Obviously, what was clearly important to the UK was getting duty-free access or quota access on their vehicles. I would expect the EU to probably be asking for similar concessions, but there could be lots of other more important sectors to the EU than auto.
Yeah, I would agree. A question that hasn't been answered, but that I think is important to just talk about. So let me ask Lawrence this question. What about the 10% BRICS tariff that Trump had threatened? Is this happening, Lawrence? Is it not happening?
I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. If
But
I
you're
had
a
to
professor,
be,
Lawrence.
uh,
It's shocking.
Trump may know today, but tomorrow he may also not know. No, I think it's pretty difficult. But just to emphasize this, if that tariff would be in addition to the 30% tariff. So that would
Yeah.
place it as at a 40%
40.
tariff
Yes, that's
margin.
right.
Now, I think the implications of that in terms of relative tariffs are pretty severe. So for other countries in which the tariff is remaining at 10%, we'd be at a really severe disadvantage. Take citrus, for example. Peru and it's Peru, Chile, for example, also export citrus to the US. These are Southern Hemisphere countries. Their seasons don't overlap with ours, and they don't overlap with the US production season. But they face a 10% tariff. If we get pushed up to 30%, it's problematic. 40%, it's even more problematic in that the long run, we'll see a diversion of imports of citrus from South Africa by US consumers, I think, shifting towards Peru and Chile. And so that really accentuates the effect. I think I just want to raise one other additional point is we focus a lot on the big exports like vehicles. Vehicles are subject to the 25% as Duane has said, and that's fixed, that's stuck. Maybe we can get it lower, but they're not affected by the reciprocal tariffs. We also focus, I think, a lot on our products that are exempted. So platinum, a lot of our key platinum products are exempted from the tariffs. They're not affected. And so the reciprocal tariffs don't affect us directly on that front. But I think what we also don't focus enough is that most products are going to be affected by the 40% tariff or the 30% tariff, sorry. And so we export, I think it's 2,500 products. Over 80% of those are going to be knocked by the full reciprocal tariff. And these are smaller export values. And so when we estimate, I mean, the median effect, over half our export products would fall by around 50% at least with this reciprocal tariff. And so this is a broad-based negative effect of this 30% tariff. If it goes to 40%, I think it's going to be even more substantive as well. But if it's going to happen, I don't know.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, Lawrence, I agree with you. I think the 10% BRICS tariff is in addition. I think it's also important to bear in mind, like the comments I was saying earlier around the 30%. So again, tariff heading, obviously there's lists for the exemptions. Okay, so we've got critical minerals. Critical minerals obviously just been subject to a 232 duty investigation. Okay, so I have seen some of the submissions. So the platinum industry as an example around obviously putting a strong the International Platinum Association putting in a strong argument saying we should keep it at zero. Okay, whether that will be the outcome or not, I think we obviously don't know. So we obviously have to wait for the final 232 critical minerals investigation to be published. Okay, so there could be some movement on the products that are currently exempt and under that Annexure 2. Okay, I think that also covers other products like pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals has also got a 232 investigation. Quite a few of them are also subject to on the exemption list. Okay, it's not just critical minerals, so I think there's some pharmaceuticals. So again, watching that with interest to say, right, from when the 232 investigation gets finalized, so will there be some products effectively get removed from the exemption list and then get added to a 232 list subject to whatever duty. Okay, so they could remain, but they could also be increased. Same with, I think, there's a 232 investigation into trucks. Okay, so I think so I think obviously watching those, understanding whether your product is subject to those 232 investigations by tariff heading, so watch that detail. Okay, so don't just assume it's on the exemption list, it's going to stay there. I don't think I think that would be not wise to assume all your products on the exemption list will stay exempt. And then I think the other one, just to reinforce, is this is levying these 50% duties on the content of a product that's being exported to the US. So let's take we use the example of the cable. Let's take a fridge as example. So I think any product that you're exporting, okay, which on a tariff heading line basis, you think is going to be subject to 30%. However, if it's got iron and steel, aluminium, and probably we think probably also copper in it, okay, you're going to have to declare that on import into the US, and that will be subject to the higher 50% duty. Okay, so again, start really thinking about how you're going to prove your aluminium, iron and steel, and copper content in your products. Otherwise, you're going to risk that the whole product is going to be subject to the higher rate of duty. Okay, so again, I think companies have got lots of work to do to make sure what their proof is going to be and how they're going to prove that to the customs authorities in the US. Thanks, Donald.
Yeah, thank you, Duane. I'm going to avoid the questions where people are asking, like, giving tariff codes, asking for an opinion. If you want those, you need to get in contact with one of us, and we can come back to you. But I'm going to avoid those because that just feels like the only thing you can do is give the wrong answer in a live forum like this. Another question is, we've got all of these other non-tariff barriers that the Trump White House has identified: BEE, expropriation without compensation, etc. How do you guys, and any of you grab this if you wish, how do you guys think this weighs in this discussion?
Well, maybe my initial comments on that. I think obviously as Lawrence was saying, that those issues matter. Okay. And I think where we are now is that whatever the South African government's response has been to date, probably overall has not been to the US government's satisfaction. Okay, so that's probably my overall comment. So I think they do need to be looked at. Okay, if we want a better tariff deal. Okay, and I would expect a lot of those areas are probably non-negotiable. Okay, so we're probably not going to move too much from our current position. So the question is, what else can we put on the table to, as we say, do a deal and lower the tariff, that 30% tariff for our exporters. Don't know, Lawrence, don't know if you've got any other comments.
No, so I think it's complicated because the concerns around the non-tariff barriers relate not only to trade, but they also relate to investment. So what the US has highlighted are key trade barriers, and many of these relate, for example, to the technical barriers or the sanitary and phytosanitary barriers in terms of accessing South African market. And these revolve around obviously food products, poultry, and pork, etc. Now, clearly, we are, as South Africans, are concerned about the health of our consumers, and that's why we have these strict sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. But to some extent, there's a trade-off, and we need to think: are we using these SPSs as barriers to trade, or for the health of the nation? And the US has raised real concerns around our use of these as a barrier to trade, not as a mechanism to protect the health of South African consumers. Now, I'll just raise the one, and I don't know if it's correct or not, but the EU raised the same problem. For example, when there's a avian influenza outbreak abroad, the Department of Agriculture bans the importation of poultry from those products because we are trying to protect South African consumers and our birds from the avian flu problem. And this is a necessary response. But they argue, and the EU argued the same thing, is that our removal of that ban, once it's been proven that the avian influenza has been eradicated in the source area, that removal is very slow and very delayed. And so they argue that this is an unnecessary barrier to trade. And so I think we need to really rethink the way in which we're using some of these barriers and how we're using them, because what this outcome has signaled is that the foreign firms are objecting to the way that we're implementing them, and they are lobbying on behalf of their firms against the South African government. The EU firms have also been pushing around this particular issue as well. And so we need to be cautious. These SPS barriers and these other barriers, to the extent that they're unnecessary, create conflicts, I think, around which firms mobilize in terms of an anti-South African perspective. On saying that again, I think linking side to this diversification story is, it turns out that in many cases, our access into foreign markets are also prevented through these SPS barriers. So we are also affected hugely by these products. And that's particularly the case in some of the emerging economies. And there, I think, for example, the DTIC has been working hard and had some success, for example, in pushing negotiation around getting, for example, AVO into China. And so this area, this use of these barriers and the global use of these kind of barriers really highlights an area of negotiation, that an area that has to be built up, and expertise that has to be built up within the DTIC, for example, around negotiating access in terms of reducing some of these barriers so that we can gain access into third country markets. Because sometimes it's not the tariff that's the problem, particularly for food, it's these other particular barriers. And then I'll just close off. I think the last related, I said, that's on trade and goods. But the US has also raised big issues around how we treat investments. And so this comes to the BEE requirements, for example. It comes to government procurement, which favors domestic firms as opposed to foreign firms. And so these are national considerations, but certainly what this crisis has done is it's raised and emphasized that these have potentially broader repercussions, these policies, and we need to really rethink, are they consistent with our strategy of growth and integration into the global economy? And this tension has been highlighted. And so now I think it's an opportunity for us to really rethink, are they working? Do they matter? Are they the right policy?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. We all forgot that Clive was here, but Clive, I've got something for you. What happens to a deal, if we get one, if the tariffs are subsequently declared unconstitutional or illegal by the US courts?
Thanks, Don. Yeah, that's a tough one. Good way to enter the conversation. I think it, I think it pits the domestic framework against the international framework, and those are typically very difficult questions. I think the agreement would be in the international frame, so I think that the agreement would hold up. Yeah, I think that's the short answer. I think that agreement would hold up because obviously we would have consented to it, because the way international law works is that it's by consent. So if you have entered into a negotiation and you've agreed between yourself and the United States in that regard, that would mean that there will be no issue between you and America. Not quite sure what that would look like from a domestic framework, but I think that the agreement would essentially supersede whatever domestic issues you might have in there. But I don't think there's a clear answer in that regard. Many countries typically struggle to find the balance between the domestic picture as opposed to the international framework. I think that's the short answer I can give.
Thank you, Clive. We're almost out of time, but the panelists have agreed to stay for a bit longer. So for those of you who would like to stick around, we are going to continue answering questions. For those of you who have to run, at the end of this, you will receive a copy of the presentation and a copy of the recording. So just to let you know. All right, my God, the questions are coming in thick and fast here. I think Duane, I see you frantically busy typing. Thank you very much. Deirdre, you ask a very important question. Please advise if the 30% duty is based on country of origin or country of export. Now, normally the answer to that would be it is based simply on country of origin. We've got this weird extra wrinkle in these particular tariffs where Trump is also concerned that people could be shipping goods through other countries. We saw this with the Vietnam agreement where Vietnam gets a 20% tariff, but if Chinese goods move through Vietnam, they get tariffed at a higher level. So this, we don't have the detail on exactly how these calculations will be performed, but I think a good rule of thumb is it should be based at least on country of origin. But I don't think it would be a good idea to send your South African goods through China to the US to test that. Leonard asks, if you generate a sales invoice to a country with a lower tariff with the US, but still physically ship from South Africa, yet invoice from the other country, the middleman, will the source of the goods still be South Africa, even though the middleman invoices? That overlaps really with the previous question as well. The invoicing is typically not the country that you need to concern yourself with, nor even where the goods are physically shipped from, but where the origin is. And so the origin is typically where most of the value is added. That would be a very crude, but probably quite useful way to think of origin. This was the risk that Duane had spoken about earlier.
But Donald, I think there's also an opportunity there, right? So if currently your paper flow goes through, so another country, okay, but the goods go directly from South Africa to the US. So you've got effectively, so you sell it at 100 Rand to a company in Europe, and they mark it up by 30%. So it's normally what would happen is the customs value will be based on the transaction value, the last sale in that flow. So it'll be based on 130. Okay, in my example, the US does allow what they call the first sale concept. So you will actually base it on the first sale from the South African company to the European company on the 100. Obviously, you obviously have to get there's requirements. You have to get rulings from the US to do it, but that's a well-established concept that we obviously can help companies get those rulings out of the US customs.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question, which I'm just going to ask and answer: when is the duty payable? When it goes into bond or when it comes out? The answer is when it comes out. Prof Tiens asks, how effectively can South Africa pivot exports to new partners, or are we currently constrained or even dependent on our existing market and geographic structures? I'm going to answer half of that and then ask Lawrence to answer the other half. So It also, to a large degree, depends on what the product is. So let's assume it's oranges that we want to send somewhere else. Well, there we've got a couple of problems. It's a fresh product. You have a limited amount of time to find another market. And if that other market hasn't approved us to make sure that we comply with whatever plant health rules they have, then you simply can't send it there, even if they are going to be short. The problem is less dramatic if you've got a product which you can put into inventory for a bit, and you can find another place, and maybe that other place doesn't have any special rules. But Lawrence, do you want to maybe just fill in any holes I've left behind there?
Well, I think it's a complicated question. I think it's very hard to pivot products to alternative markets, particularly agricultural products, because you have to fulfill a whole lot of requirements in order to gain access. But I think it's also made complicated because, and Duane can talk a little bit more about this. I mean, firms are locked in. It can be quite difficult, and with this is this this this
Oh, Lawrence,
tariff
we are losing you.
story and this uncertainty, a lot of certainty about the risk. Okay, is effectively challenging these supply chains, which is going to make re-establishing them quite complicated. The key point, I think it's a longer term proposal, but you need to start working on this now in order to enable the shift to alternative markets, because it's not quick and easy.
Yeah, I'd add to that, something within my own team that we've been throwing around is carefully tracking where competitor countries to us. So, Lawrence, you'd mentioned in your webinar last week that Peru and Chile, for example, are potential competitors with citrus. So it could be an interesting exercise to understand where they are currently sending to. I mean, the amount of oranges in the world is not going to change between now and the 1st of August. And so if we understand what that looks like, there's an interesting exercise we're fiddling with to say, where should you be focusing your attention? And also, could we have a conversation with countries like Chile and Peru to see if there's some way that we can cooperate in this sharing exercise? And also, I would suspect we will find a lot of countries, assuming we're not introducing any genuine risk into their market, we may find quite a few people very open to the idea of fast tracking permission into their country. Of course, I think they'd expect something similar here. But we haven't commenced work on it. We've been talking about it, but I think that might help to some degree to just at least figure out where you should be looking. But I don't think it solves the problem for oranges or nachis necessarily, but just conceptually, that's something we've been throwing around.
Maybe just to add quickly to that. With the shock, I mean, firms are trying to find alternative markets. So South Africa is not the only one trying to find another market. In fact, the Chinese exporters are already trying to reorientate to different markets. So the global markets become a lot more competitive. And so I think it's a real challenge in terms of potentially finding new markets. We also may find that, for example, there could be some crowding out of our exporters in established markets. We did some analysis. We suggested maybe the crowding out concerns around China in sub-Saharan Africa are exaggerated. They may not be so big, but nevertheless, South African exporters could find themselves facing increased competition in third country markets as goods are deflected away from the US market as well. I think that talks again to really trying to, in terms of us, concluding the African growth and African free trade area and continental free trade area. And that's still not concluded. We're not trading under preferences and into Africa outside of the SADC agreement, which we already have. And so, because the agreement hasn't been concluded. And so another way for us to try and lock in markets and insulate ourselves a little bit from this deflection is by trying to conclude the AfCFTA and get that off the ground so that we can trade under preferences.
Yeah, completely. Agree. We've got some overlapping questions, but let me see which one of these I can quickly throw out here. This is a very good question from Nick. If you do final partial assembly in the US, will this reduce import tariffs? Well, the answer there is a maybe, but probably not as things stand right now. So your goods are going to be tariffed in the form that they arrive at the border. So if, for example, you're sending container loads of I don't know, wheelbarrows to the US, and they're knocked down into their different components, that is not going to make a difference if you assemble them here or there. That's probably not a great example from a shipping perspective. A lot will depend on what the product is when it arrives. So if you're sending a few components and you're really doing the bulk of the assembly there, that will be tariffed differently to if you send the whole product. But just assembling in the US should not typically affect what your duty will be. Peter Pretorius asks an incredibly sensible question. Surely higher import duties will have a negative effect on the US economy. It'll push up inflation as imported goods will be more expensive. Peter, everybody except for Trump agrees with you. But Lawrence, perhaps I'm missing something here. Would you like to put your economist hat on and tell us what we got wrong here?
So to be difficult, it won't necessarily increase inflation. I mean, so firstly, inflation is a percentage change in prices, and so first of all, it may just lead to a level change in prices, which would reveal itself as an inflation shock in the short period. But after that period, with new higher prices, inflationary effects may remove completely. So that's the first kind of conceptual issue to think a little about. The second issue is that inflation is a macroeconomic factor. And so in part driven by macroeconomic demand and supply relationships. So if the tariffs reduce US growth and they reduce consumption, you may actually find that they're offsetting effects on inflation. And so these would offset the tariff price increases. Thirdly, what you might find is that if imports substantially reduce into the United States because of the tariffs to try and reduce the trade deficit, well, what would happen is the currency would appreciate. And if the dollar appreciates, what that would do is help offset the tariffs again. So the inflation story is pretty complicated. What it does tell us, though, is that someone is going to pay, though. It's not a free lunch, and it's invariably not going to be the exporter. The exporter may bear some margin, but in effect, the US will pay higher prices in some form. Someone's going to pay the tariff, and invariably it ends up to be the US consumers. I just want to conclude. It invariably becomes the US poorer households because they tend to spend most of their money on goods, whereas wealthier households spend more money on disproportionately spend on services. So it's a regressive tax system as well for the US consumer.
Maybe just to add to that, something else of consequence here, your comment on the currency, we should expect it to appreciate. I mean, of course, it hasn't behaved that way, which is what the expectation in April that all of us had on the same panel was that we should see an appreciation, but the currency is depreciated by 10%. And that to me is fascinating. I'm sort of still mulling over what exactly is going on here, but it is interesting to note. I mean, of course, the currency doesn't only respond to trade forces. It also deals with things like investment flows, etc. But it is interesting that it has not behaved in the way that it typically would have behaved. Leon asks, will there not will oh my goodness, Leon, sorry, I'm not sure what your that is referring to. I'm going to skip your question, unfortunately. The US at some point announced that they will charge tariffs on the film industry for productions that are done outside the US. Do tariffs also include film production? So Linda, the answer is it shouldn't, because that's a service and these tariffs are not affecting services. But I'd forgotten about that. And yes, Trump did threaten to do that. I've got to think that would be an unbelievably difficult thing to do. But I don't know if any of my colleagues have a different take. No?
Donald, I agree with you. I think trying to levy some kind of tariff on foreign produced films to try and get to move the film industry into their local jurisdiction, I think would probably be really challenging just to practically do. Obviously, lots of countries offer incentives to their film industry to attract more films to be made in the country. That's probably what I think they should be doing, because they're actually probably competing and they're probably losing film productions to other countries because the other countries offer better incentive programs. I mean, South Africa's got an incentive program, but most countries that have got film industries have got some kind of lucrative incentive program. So that's probably what they should be thinking of doing.
Yeah. But also the film industry in the US from a labor perspective is highly regulated, pushing up costs of production quite significantly over many other countries, as I understand it.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Duane, I see you're already picking up business here. Well done. Well done. If I were from Nick, if I were exporting to the US, I would open an office there and export to this office at cost. I would then invoice full price from within the US and could possibly keep my profits offshore. This would be disastrous for SA, but protect my business views. Nick, that's one of the questions I probably shouldn't answer here and say we need to meet with you and have a proper conversation. That's a very complicated proposal because you've got transfer pricing issues there. Your rules of valuation are not identical when you're trading with related parties. So it is simply not as simple as just opening the office there, selling at cost. Not as easy as doing that. But nevertheless, if you want to have that conversation, we need to have a cup of coffee and a talk about it. All right.
Donald, just a quick, it might be worth talking a little bit about the AGOA and the loss of AGOA effect, because I think some panelists, some discussants raised this particular question. So maybe you want to have a quick kickoff on that.
Oh, no, you go right ahead. Or do you want me to?
No, you start. I'll add if needed.
Well, so AGOA, but it's maybe important to just go back to what did AGOA give us? So on average, AGOA gave us a 3.5% advantage into the US. Smaller on cars, it used to give us 2.5% on cars. Now, what that meant was practically that if we exported under those codes, we didn't pay a duty. Most of our competitors would have paid 3.5%. If we lose AGOA, our 30% tariff, should that come to pass, will effectively move to 33.5 at an average level, by the way. I'm not talking about by tariff code, but that roughly would be the effect. Lawrence, do I have that right?
Partly, because it would be a 33% tariff on those products that are subject to non-zero MFN duties. So a very high proportion of our goods enter into the US under zero MFN anyway. In other words, there's no duty on the US. A high proportion of those goods, the critical minerals, currently face no tariffs at all, and they're exempted from the reciprocal tariffs. That may change, as Duane was saying, from the Section 232. So it's really for those products where the MFN tariff is non-zero. And that's a wide range of products. But I think, as you pointed out, for many products, it's a pretty small margin. For vehicles, it's a 2.5%. For citrus, it's 1.9 cents per kilogram, which turns out to be under 2% tariff preference margin. So the margins are pretty small. I think, as we spoke before, the loss of AGOA really is substantive too, because it's a loss of an agreement in which firms have established supply networks based on the expected certainty and continuation of that agreement. So the 2.5% margin may be small in the short term, but in the long term, it accumulates over time. And so it can affect firms' decisions of where to locate. So losing it, I think, would have an implication. As many, I think, were asking, so if the 30% tariff, even with the reciprocal tariff under the current AGOA agreement, we still enter those products duty-free. So we'd only pay the 30%. If we lose AGOA, then we'd pay the additional MFN over and above the existing tariff.
Yeah, that I completely agree with. Let me see. Are tariffs charged the same way on e-commerce platforms? I'm thinking of ways to support SMEs, Linda. So there've been some interesting shifts here recently, both not only in the US, but even in South Africa, since platforms like Shein and Temu came about. So in the US, there used to be a de minimis exemption, which means if your value fell below, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was $900. So if the value of your shipment was below $900, you could send it off and you would just clear it through and you wouldn't pay anything. Trump, I know he lifted that. In other words, you just have to pay the tariff, but I'm not actually sure if that is still the case at the moment, because that was creating enormous problems with getting goods into the country quickly. So courier companies posted goods were then starting to face really long queues. And we have a similar set of rules, by the way, in South Africa. And the reason we have those rules, I mean, they were written before platforms like Shein and Temu came about, is that the cost of typically enforcing is so much higher than any benefit you get, that it was just easier to let it flow. But I'm not sure what the current status is, Linda. That's a very good question, and I'll look into it. Thank you. Anyone want to add to that?
I think the only thing I've heard on the e-commerce is, I think, especially for China, those de minimis rules have been removed or increased significantly, right? So a lot of those products will then effectively, the de minimis rule will no longer apply, so they have to be cleared, and the duty rates applied on import on what the normal tariff rates would be. So I think that's obviously what I think they're trying to do in many jurisdictions. I mean, yeah, US is one, South Africa is another one, because obviously e-commerce has increased so significantly.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Nyla, good morning. What is the opinion of the panel on the amount of disruption that the tariffs from the US has caused for the global market? I mean, certainly we've done no modeling on that at all. Lawrence, I'm not sure if you and your guys have done anything.
No, look, I think it's super uncertain. So we saw, for example, some British companies and EU companies discontinued exporting to wait it out to figure out what's going to happen. That's disruptive. Secondly, what we've seen is, as Duane was saying, is firms are massively increasing the exports into the US in order to try and beat the reciprocal tariff increases. So we saw that particularly before the reciprocal tariffs were imposed. And so it's just very uncertain, I think, at the moment. Yeah.
And I think maybe just building on that, I think a lot of the economic forecasts that have been coming out of the IMF and other, I suppose, global economic hubs, and also even our sort of global economics team in the US, who was analyzing this. I mean, generally, this seems to be a downward trend, right? Okay, on economic growth. It seems to have a negative consequence as opposed to an overall positive impact. How big that impact is, yeah, I think at this point in time is obviously not sure, because it's just such in a state of flux. Lawrence?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what's interesting is that you haven't seen the inflationary effect of the tariffs passing through to the US market,
Yeah.
and the US market still
Yes.
seems quite buoyant, which I think has surprised many. But I think, building on your point, in the effects, I think, filter through much more in the longer term than this immediate story. So one argument why the inflationary effects haven't been realized is that these exporting firms or the importing firms in the US preloaded and preempted some of these tariffs by increasing their stock, and that's being released into the market. And once that's been finished, then the tariffs will start to be binding. But yeah, it's uncertain for all of us too.
No, absolutely. We're going to be wrapping up now. We don't have any more questions. We did post the poll earlier. Nadia, could you perhaps just share the poll on the screen, the poll results? I'd like to see the outcome. So 72% of us think that Trump will impose the tariff on the 1st of August. 28% think it's going to be Tucker. So let's see. For all of you that attended, and the 4 of you that managed to stick it out till the end, you will be receiving a copy of the presentation and a copy of the recording, probably this afternoon, but at latest on Monday. Our contact details are there. Feel free to contact any of us if you want to speak to us. If you want to set up appointments, share some of your money with us for people who make a living selling advice, please do so. Thank you very much, and have a
I don't
wonderful
make a
week.
living selling advice. I'm an academic.
No, but you make
I'll
too
give
much
it to you
money
for free.
already. What's that? Well,
I'll give you the advice for free.
So whatever you do, do not speak to Lawrence.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Take care, guys. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Goodbye.